Welcome to this briefing on Infrastructure Victoria's draft 30-year infrastructure strategy. I'm Jonathan Spear, Deputy CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, and also I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we might be meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and of course any emerging elders and leaders as well. Today is an opportunity to give you an introduction to the draft strategy update, which was released by Infrastructure Victoria on the 9th of December. Our 30-year infrastructure strategy is a draft, and it's making 95 recommendations for infrastructure reform and the investment we need in Victoria over the next 30 years. And as you'll see, as I explain the key themes of the strategy, we're looking at how we confront long-term challenges to the state, how we manage urban change, ways in which we can harness infrastructure for productivity and growth, and really importantly, the role of infrastructure in developing regional Victoria. These are draft recommendations, and you've got the opportunity to have your say until the end of February 2021. And at the end of this presentation, I'll give you some more details about how you can do that. So the first 30-year infrastructure strategy produced by Infrastructure Victoria was delivered in 2016, and it was tabled in Parliament, and the Victorian government responded to that with a 5-year infrastructure plan. We've had a lot of change in Victoria over the last few years. Even just in this last 12 months, we've been dealing with bushfires and coronavirus, and now of course we're looking to how we emerge from that to have a better new normal in Victoria. And so it's a great time to be introducing a draft 30-year infrastructure strategy for everyone to give their feedback on. And what we will do is take that feedback and use it to finalise the strategy that will get tabled in the Victorian Parliament in mid-2021. And then there's an opportunity for the government to respond to that strategy and issue an updated version of their 5-year plan about the policies and projects and reforms that they're going to make for Victoria's infrastructure. The 30-year infrastructure strategy has a range of objectives that it's trying to achieve, and these are objectives that we have consulted on over recent years and are pretty similar to the objectives of the original 2016 strategy. Infrastructure doesn't exist for its own sake. Rather, what we're trying to do is have infrastructure help us do things like prepare for population growth, lift our economic productivity, and have Victoria become a more sustainable place. And of course, we want infrastructure to be resilient to shocks, to help reduce disadvantage and help us adapt to climate change and other changes in the environment, such as those we've been through in the last 12 months. So what I'll now do is describe to you each of the key themes of the strategy and some of the recommendations we're making in them, some of the consultation questions that we've identified that we would really like feedback on. And as you can see here, we've got these 4 main themes of confronting long-term challenges, managing urban change, harnessing infrastructure for productivity and growth, and developing regional Victoria. And you will see that this is the way in which the draft strategy is organised, with then some sub-chapters under each of those that get into more detail about what the particular challenge or opportunity is there, what the evidence is that we've gathered and what we've heard from stakeholders already, and then what recommendations we are making as draft recommendations to help address these particular challenges. So firstly, we really need to be looking as to how Victoria confronts some of its big long-term challenges. And so what you'll see is recommendations along the lines of things like the importance of accelerating the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles, because we need to reduce emissions in our transport sector if we're to achieve the net zero emissions target that the government has set for 2050. And at the same time, of course, we're going through an energy transition at the moment of moving to much more renewable energy And so we've got recommendations about building a lot of that renewable energy capability in the regions especially, but then making sure it is connected to the rest of the network so that energy is delivered where it needs to be. We're also, of course, facing climate change, which we're already experiencing and is likely to get worse in the coming decades. And so we have recommendations, especially around water infrastructure and the need for us to think about using all forms of water infrastructure and water sources. So things like greater use of recycled water, greater capturing of stormwater, so that we're less reliant upon rainfall as the only source of water that we have. And of course, when we think about the future, we often think about technology, and technology has played a key part in our lives more than ever over the last 12 months, as we have been schooling from home, working from home, doing more online commerce, and in some cases, seeing the doctor from home. And so what we are recommending is that there be even greater use of those technologies to deliver government services, for example. So we can see that there's great ability to continue to expand telehealth, especially for regional areas, to continue to drive some of the efficiencies that the justice system has been using in the courts during the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, we'll see recommendations about better connecting the regions with more reliable internet connections and mobile coverage so that regional businesses and families can also take advantage of those online services. So what we want to hear from you particularly about is how the Victorian government can continue to support the transition to low and zero emissions vehicles and how that can be accelerated. You'll see we have recommendations about how important it is for greater energy efficiency in buildings, because not only does that save us money in our hip pockets and have a more comfortable home, it also means we have less desire and demand for energy infrastructure to really meet those real peaks of very hot or very cold days, and that will help with our energy transition. And we want to hear your views about the ways in which we can continue to drive energy efficiency and move our energy system towards net zero emissions. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the sources of water that we need to be thinking about more in the future is the use of recycled water. And of course, some people aren't entirely comfortable with using recycled water for drinking, even though it is used in places like Western Australia or California and Singapore. And we want to hear from people about what it would take for them to be feeling confident about using recycled water for drinking. So the next big theme is around how we manage urban change. We've seen a lot of change in Victoria's cities, Melbourne and regional cities in recent years, especially from population growth. And while there's been a dip in that growth this year due to having less people come to Australia due to travel restrictions, we expect that in coming decades there will be continued growth of our population. And there's a real opportunity for us to make sure that the livability that we have in Melbourne and regional cities continues while we have really good infrastructure to support that growing population. So we've got a strong emphasis on the importance of integrating our infrastructure planning with our land use planning so that the infrastructure is delivered where and when it's needed for when people come, whether for their jobs or for their homes, that the infrastructure is there to serve them. We're also making recommendations about enabling more people to live in established areas of Melbourne and other regional cities where there's already good infrastructure. So things like good transport infrastructure, so we can make better use of that infrastructure and give people more diverse housing choices about where they can live in a way that's affordable. During the coronavirus pandemic, many of us have been getting out and about in open spaces near our homes and on our bikes or walking, and we think that that is something that needs continued investment because we know that if we have good, high quality open spaces that are green and connected, not only is it a more comfortable place to be, it means that if we're out there cycling or walking to the shops or to a station, we can do that much more comfortably. And having that green canopy, especially in growth areas, is increasingly important to manage climate change as well. You'll see in our strategy that it's not all about transport. We are certainly recommending that there be upgrades and renewal of social housing infrastructure and other forms of infrastructure that support social services. And there's been some really good announcements by the government about social housing investment recently. What our assessment is that that's going to need to continue to be delivered in coming decades. So some of the things that we are really interested in hearing from people about is there's real value in government publishing plans about what it is intending in the future for areas like transport sector, or where new skills are going to be built, or where new electricity infrastructure is going to be. But of course, the government has to balance publishing those plans with meeting community expectations. And we're interested in what people would find most useful in publishing those long-term plans that isn't also raising unrealistic expectations. We're interested in what people think about whether the Victorian government should be prioritising investment in open space, in safe separated cycleways, and better footpaths. We'd really like to hear what people think about improving accessibility on a public transport network for people who are not as mobile, because we know that that is an issue, especially for the tram network. And we're interested in understanding whether people would like to move to live in established suburbs where there's good infrastructure, but also what that would mean for people who live there already and how that can be done in a way that benefits the existing residents as well as future residents. So the third area, the third theme of the strategy is about harnessing infrastructure for productivity and growth. So we know that infrastructure can play a really strong role in supporting economic growth, but also supporting a fairer society and a more sustainable society. And so here you'll see some of our recommendations around big transport projects, but also how we make better use of the infrastructure we already have. So we are talking about things like planning for future rail line upgrades on the existing rail lines, and in some cases extending them in growth areas. We're making recommendations to continue to plan for some big major transport projects. For example, Melbourne Metro 2, which would connect the north of Melbourne through Fisherman's Bend and to Newport in the west, which would of course help improve the metropolitan transport system, but also help unlock growth in Fisherman's Bend and actually clear the way for better regional train service as well. So that's something that we think the planning needs to be getting on and done for that and some other major transport projects. But also, we think that there's really important social infrastructure planning that can be done in a way that's different to how we have in the past. So for example, we know that as part of self-determination, Aboriginal community-controlled infrastructure is really important. And we're recommending that the state government co-design a plan for what the priority community-controlled infrastructure would be for Aboriginal communities. And so all of this is about planning ahead so that we're making better use of our existing infrastructure, but also we're very carefully selecting the major transport and other non-transport projects that we need in future to help us over the next 3 decades. So some of the things we want to hear from people for is we have a bus network that is generally a bit unloved in Victoria. Let's be honest about it. And so how can we encourage Victorians to value buses and use buses more for public transport journeys? Because there's lots of potential there. How can we best persuade people about the value of keeping some options open for future big transport projects? So doing the planning, keeping the options open, and then being open in our minds about the exact date at which we need to build them. We're really interested in whether people support our recommendation for the much greater tree canopy cover in parts of Melbourne that currently have low tree canopy cover. And we're calling for much greater ongoing investment in social housing, and we're interested in people's levels of support for that and what they think the right target is that we should be shooting for. The fourth of our themes is around developing regional Victoria. And what you'll see here is that we've taken an approach that looks at how to build on the economic strengths that each area of regional Victoria has, and also how to address disadvantages that might exist in the regions. And so you'll see recommendations about improving internet connectivity, which we know is very important and still is patchy in regional Victoria. We will talk about and have recommendations that there be much greater security about funding for road and freight rail maintenance in regional areas, because that's important for safety in getting around in regional Victoria, but also making sure that our farmers and other regional producers and manufacturers can get their goods to market in time and at a competitive price. And we've heard a lot about the importance of improving public transport within regional areas, where we know that often the quality and the time of services for public transport in regional Victoria just doesn't make it a very attractive option. And then we've made recommendations on the social side around building more social infrastructure, particularly where we can group social infrastructure together in hubs where we can share the costs and deliver a better service to meet community needs. And we're recommending things like making sure that there is appropriate health services in the regions, both new hospitals, new treatment for drug and alcohol facilities, and greater use of telehealth where that's appropriate. And we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years delving into all the evidence around what is happening in regional Victoria now in the future and what underpins the needs for infrastructure in regional areas. And we've been out and about talking to regional stakeholders about what they think the priorities are. So what you'll see is for every region of Victoria, we have published a dedicated profile that talks about our assessment of infrastructure priorities in each region and what we've heard from stakeholders so far, and what the recommendations that we're making mean for each region. So I'd really encourage, especially regional Victorians, to check out the profile we have in relation to your region and let us know what you think. Some of the things we've identified is, of course, are there other ways in which improved digital connectivity can be delivered in Victoria's regions, because we know that's important. We also know that having high quality regional roads is super important, but sometimes we're not actually able to upgrade and keep the maintenance of all regional roads to the same standard. So we're interested in feedback about what people think about having a hierarchy of roads that is clearly defined and then maintained in a way that we all agree is appropriate. We're also interested in what people have to say about the priorities for local public transport needs and where in particular big improvements might be made. And on the economic side, we know that tourism is a big potential growth area for lots of regional Victoria, especially nature-based tourism and Aboriginal cultural tourism. And so as more people, both domestic and international travellers, return to the regions, what is the tourism infrastructure that would really help grow those economic opportunities? So, of course, as I said at the start, and as we're all really aware, we've been through a really challenging year in Victoria with bushfires and then COVID. And what you'll see in the draft 30-year strategy is some identification of some specific actions that we're recommending the Victorian government take in the short term, so over the next 18 to 24 months, that will help recover from COVID and build a better new normal. And when I talk about building a better new normal, what I mean is that these are things that will help us in the short term, but they also make a lot of sense for the medium to long term as well. So we have identified actions like upgrading and delivering additional social housing, delivering regional road and freight maintenance, building on the enthusiasm that people have for cycling and walking in interconnected open spaces that we've all developed during the lockdown, and delivering that sort of active transport green infrastructure. And of course, continuing to invest in the infrastructure that underpins better mental health and physical health. So you'll be able to see a list of those at the start of the strategy, and then it connects with the recommendations that we make later on throughout. So this is a draft strategy, and at Infrastructure Victoria, we take consultation and engagement really seriously. It is part of our DNA, and we would really like to hear from you. Because what we will be doing before we finalise the strategy is integrating stakeholder input and any additional evidence that you have to give to us. We're also going to be doing additional modelling and research in the coming months and doing some refinements to our costings of each of the recommendations. So if there's anything you'd like to bring out to our attention around what you think of these recommendations or any evidence you think we've missed, we would love to hear it, because we will take that and use it for the final strategy that gets tabled in Parliament in the middle of next year. And this is your opportunity to influence the all members of Parliament and of course the Victorian government's investments and policy settings in the next few years, but also over the next 3 decades. So we're going to be out and about in January and February, engaging with members of the community, undertaking some deliberative engagement, talking to stakeholders and all levels of government, federal, state and local. And when I talk about deliberative engagement, there's this particular question that we are diving into in a lot of detail with around 450 Victorians. We're going to be spending a few weeks with them talking in detail about how the Victorian government can support more people to adopt low and zero emission vehicles sooner. Because as I said earlier on, meeting Victoria's climate targets, its target to have net zero emissions by 2050, is going to mean that we're going to have much lower emissions from our transport sector. And if you're interested in being involved, then you can register to participate in that deliberative engagement. It's open for a few more days now and in December. So you're really welcome to go to the Infrastructure Victoria website and register your interest in taking part in that. But of course, there's broader ways in which you can get involved in the strategy as well. So on the Engage Victoria website, you can make a submission or do a survey, and it can be about all or just parts of the strategy that you're interested in. We will also be holding workshops and focus groups from late January and into February, and we'll be releasing more information about the subject and the details of those and how you can get involved in coming weeks. So if you'd like to stay in touch with us, feel free to send us an email to this address. You can go to infravic.com/30-year strategy, which will get you to the consultation website, and you can go to the Infrastructure Victoria website, of course, where, as always, you will see our reports as well as a wealth of the underlying information that we publish for everybody to use and see. So I'd like to thank you for tuning into this webinar, and really look forward to hearing your thoughts and meeting some of you, maybe even in person over the next few months. And we really want to encourage you to have your say, because it will make a better strategy for infrastructure in our state in the next 30 years. And that'll mean that we have a fairer, more prosperous, more sustainable Victoria, and that'll be better for everybody. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you.